I mean, look I live in California. I am under the California legal codes. I'm supposed to understand those codes literally. Now, if you're in Vermont and you're reading the California legal codes to understand what the California legal codes mean, you still are obliged, it seems to me, to understand those literally. Being in a different state doesn't mean you read them in a different way. It simply means that those laws that you understand literally do not apply to you because you are not the people who fall under the jurisdiction of that law. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? Now, Peter, who Kirsten was interacting with here, seems to think that if a biblical command is to be taken literally, then it is to be applied universally. The same mistake that Dawkins makes in his book, The God Delusion. Now, think of this. Jesus told Peter to cast his net into deep water. Now, was Peter to understand Jesus' words literally or figuratively? Well, I suspect literally because of what Peter did. What did he do? He cast his net into deep water, and he caught a lot of fish. Now, just because we understand Jesus' command to Peter to be literal, it does not mean that you and I are obliged to cast our nets into deep water. This was a directive to Peter, not to us. It only applied to him. And in the same way, the words of the Mosaic Law, like all laws, are to be understood in their usual and most basic sense without metaphor or allegory, free from exaggeration or distortion. That's our definition of literal. The Jews and the theocracy, then, they have an obligation to obey this law in that way because that's the legal code that God gave to them. But it's not the legal code that God gave to Gentiles. Therefore, even if the words are to be taken literally, it does not mean that there is universal application of those words to us now. Both Pete and Dawkins are mistaken on this point. And by the way, if anybody thinks otherwise, like Pete, then he is obliged to buy a net and throw it in deep water because Jesus said so. By the way, I was a little bit bothered by the challenge of hypocritical for those people who don't take the Bible literally in the way that Pete suggested. Because a hypocrite, and mark this, by the way, so that you don't get hit by this sucker punch. A hypocrite is a faker. He isn't simply somebody who doesn't do what he thinks is right. Some people are inconsistent in their behavior. Some people are morally weak. They affirm one set of moral rules, but they don't keep them. They do something else. By the way, that's pretty much everybody. Nobody, no matter what side of the aisle you're on in this discussion, Christian or non-Christian, moralist or relativist, nobody does everything they think that they should be doing. That doesn't make everybody a hypocrite. The word hypocrite comes from the words that describe an actor, somebody who puts a mask on. A hypocrite, then, is a faker, somebody who pretends to be one thing and turns out to be something completely different. He's a pretender. He is somebody who is insincere. So it's not hypocritical when one makes a good faith attempt at making proper distinctions about the application of verses. The hypocrisy challenge, I think, is not a substantive response. It's just another example of name calling. I think in this case, it's a weak attempt at that. Poisoning the well. Oh, if you don't see it my way, you're a hypocrite. Nonsense. And as for making the Bible subject to interpretation, I hope you realize that all language is subject to interpretation. This cannot be avoided. Everything needs to be interpreted. You are interpreting my words right now as you listen. You can't do otherwise. You are listening to the words that I speak. You are being aware, somewhat subconsciously, I guess, of the context in which I speak and to what I'm speaking. And you are drawing conclusions about my meaning from all of those things. And it may be that you misunderstand my meaning. And if some of you have a discussion afterwards about what Koukl really had in mind when he gave his opening commentary on the show on Sunday, you probably will adjudicate the differences by trying to go back to the words and to figure out what exactly was an accurate take given those circumstances and those words. I mean, you can't avoid this. Sometimes people's statements are largely univocal. In other words, it's hard to imagine how they can mean something else. But a lot of times they're equivocal. They could mean different things, and you have no choice but try to interpret and figure out what's going on. There's nothing dishonest or disingenuous or untoward about this process. It's the nature of communication. And so to say that the Bible is subject to interpretation is only to say that the Bible is written in words. It's an attempt of communication by one person to another through the medium of language, and we have to try to figure out what this author intended to mean by the words he used. That's it. Can't avoid that. It does not at all mean that the Bible itself is not authoritative or inspired. If God were to speak from the clouds right now, and we're going to say stipulate it is in fact God speaking, so by definition these are the infallible, inspired, inerrant words of God, we would still have to what? Interpret them. We'd have to figure out what they meant. But that doesn't mean they are any less from God as a result. By the way, and just closing on this, I agree with Peter that metaphors like sheep and analogies like the mustard seed are to be understood in their normal sense as figures of speech. But this does not mean that the task of interpretation is completely open-ended. Like any interpretation is just as good as any other interpretation. So strictly speaking, there are not varying degrees of interpretation, but rather different kinds of language or literature that need to be interpreted. So we could have factual stuff, straightforward factual stuff. We could have poetry. We could have history. We could have, music, songs. All of these are to be understood in light of their genre. But it isn't like varying degrees of interpretation that in some sense cast doubt on the authority of those things that have been spoken. And by the way, and I closed to my niece Kirsten on this note, what did Peter say about the other questions I asked? And if you recall from last week, there were about 6 or 7 of them that were things that he had to address in virtue of his own position and his own challenge. Like if he doesn't take this literally, about homosexuals in the Old Testament, what about Jesus' command to love your enemies? Gee, why would you take that literally? Now that is a silly sounding issue. Who would ever say you must love your enemies? Now, of course, we know Jesus said that a long time ago. We're used to it, and so it kind of is familiar to our ears. But set yourself outside of that for a moment and take that statement. Wouldn't it sound so bizarre that you'd be inclined not to take it literally the first time you heard it? But they seem to take this literally and at face value. So those are some of the questions I asked, which did not get an answer. By the way, even if I am a hypocrite for not promoting the execution of homosexuals, Jesus as God was responsible for that part of the Bible. I didn't make that up. All right? Jesus did not promote homosexuality. Instead, he identified God's ordained order of one man, one woman in monogamous marriage, and that's another thing you can't get away from, no matter how you resolve this other issue. Okay.